This is how a nuclear war could start, how a series of seemingly rational decisions at the time they were made lead to the irrational outcome of a nuclear exchange between the United States and Russia. There's an article just published on War on the Rocks by Jeremy Shapiro called "We're on a Path to Nuclear War" that we're going to run through here. I'll post a link to the article in the description below so you can check it out. But in short, Shapiro walks through a path where a bunch of kind of logical steps from where we are today leads us to a point where Russia's seemingly only option remaining is the use of strategic nuclear weapons. Now, before we dive in, Jeremy Shapiro is the Director of Research at the European Council on Foreign Relations, a non-resident senior fellow at the Brookings Institution, and served at the U.S. State Department from 2009 to 2013. So there are his credentials. I'll pull up the article here, again posted in the description below. One of the first things they get to, and I think it's worth pointing out, is that both sides, right here, in Ukraine, both sides have publicly pledged that they cannot lose this war. They hold that doing so would threaten their very way of life and the values that they hold most dear. In the Russian case particularly, a loss in Ukraine would seem to threaten regime survival and even the territorial integrity of the country. That, I think, frames this whole situation. If you think about it, it's hard to envision a scenario today where either side, Russia or Ukraine, willingly backs down from where they sit. Shapiro gets into a series of red lines that realistically have been crossed from the very start of the war. If you think about it, when Putin launched the invasion of Ukraine, he right out said, if the West intervenes in his invasion of Ukraine, the West faces consequences greater than any they have faced in history. And here we are, middle of October, and NATO and Western countries have sent more weapons, supplies, even intelligence to Ukraine than I ever thought was realistic. There are things going to Ukraine now. I think F-16s are even on the table of being discussed right now, whether or not that actually happens. But that wasn't even a consideration or a realistic consideration back in February, March, April, May. It just continued. There's one red line that's been crossed. And there's a ton of these we could run through. We're just going to hit a couple. Then in May, Russia warns long-range U.S. missiles at Ukraine border intolerable. Usually this refers to the ATACMS, Army Tactical Missile System, but actually the quote here refers to the HIMARS and the MLRS, and the Russian ambassador is specifically talking about the Mike 3-1 Gimler's guided missiles. So those are the munitions that are in Ukraine. So another red line seemingly crossed. Move a little further down the line into July, and this one is, still a few months ago, but relevant to some current events here. An attack on Crimea will ignite a Judgment Day response. And just last week, or at the start of this week, there was an attack. I think they're technically still figuring out exactly the cause of the attack, but there was seemingly an attack. There was something happened at the Kerch Bridge, the Crimean Bridge. Another potential red line cross. Now, what Shapiro lays out in his article is that it's not necessarily these red lines being crossed that could lead to the use of nuclear weapons, but rather shifts on the battlefield, changes on the battlefield. So let's say Russia continues to lose territory either in the east or the south. Map took a minute to catch up there. You'll see these blue areas are areas that Ukraine has retaken back from Russia. If they were to push south specifically towards Crimea, and this distance from Kherson down to Crimea is only about 50 miles, it's not crazy. If Ukraine were to threaten taking Crimea, that could be a potential tipping point, because there have been plenty of people inside of Russia that have argued already that the use of tactical nuclear weapons on the battlefield should be considered, should be used. So in this hypothetical situation, hypothetical scenario that doesn't seem that far out of realistic, if Ukraine takes Kherson in the south, continues pushing on Crimea, they don't have to take it, just pushing towards it. Let's say Russia decides that it's time to use a tactical nuclear weapon, the smallest one they have, or a very small one. In this situation, the target doesn't even matter, really, because we're not talking about stopping Ukraine's military progress as much as Russia saying enough is enough. You have to believe us. We're willing to go the nuclear route seriously and using that somewhere on the battlefield, or I should just say in Ukraine. It could be against a civilian target, could be against a military target. The logic behind that would be Russia not using a nuclear weapon on NATO countries or on the United States, but sending a message to Ukraine's Western allies that if you want to continue this war, we're ready to go nuclear. Russia's gamble is that the West would back off at that point, figuring that maybe we finally did reach a red line. But I have a hard time believing that's where it would actually stop. Could you imagine a nuclear strike happening in Ukraine? And man, what percentage of the voices would say, we can't let this stand? They have to pay for this. If we let Russia get away with this, then what is North Korea going to do? What is China going to do? We're sending a message that you can get whatever you want by using nuclear weapons. And there's already been warnings, I could say, maybe threats that the U.S. warns right here of catastrophic consequences if Russia uses nukes in Ukraine. So the U.S. in this scenario has to come up with a proportional response, which would not mean a nuclear weapon fired at Russia, but perhaps a conventional strike carried out against Russian formations in Ukraine. Once that happens, Russia, as we move over here to this next map showing Russia and NATO countries, if the United States, maybe NATO, launches this conventional strike against Russian troop formations in Ukraine in any way, shape, or form, you can see Russia having to take the stance of, we need to show that we are able and willing to defend ourselves against these attacks from the West. Putin's been talking about they're at war with NATO and at war with the West forever. So rather than just letting these attacks happen, Russia strikes back. And the place they strike back would make sense to be the source, perhaps, of where those strikes came from, those missiles, those aircraft took off from, which are likely inside of a NATO country. So Russia retaliates by striking inside of a NATO country to send the message again, we will defend ourselves, do not carry this forward. That NATO country that is now hit by Russian munitions invokes Article 5. An attack on one is an attack on all. And NATO begins to take out Russian offensive capabilities. Makes sense, you heard that term before, right? Want to take out Russia's ability to strike inside of NATO territory again. Once again, conventional strikes carried out by NATO into Russian territory to stop Russia's ability to strike NATO. Conventional, still. But Russia, at this point, being on edge, Putin has been concerned for a long time that the sole U.S. focus is regime change, the top of their government. And it's very, very difficult to tell a government in the middle of a war, in the middle of an active war, what the bounds of the operation are going to be. There's no way, once these NATO strikes begin kicking off against Russian formations, that a message of we're going to stop at this, that, or the other, we're not here to topple Russia, there's no room for that. It's too chaotic, too fast, it's spiraling out of control. And the minute those NATO strikes begin to have success against the Russian military, Putin and the Russian military and the Russian leadership very well may see their ability to counter future NATO strikes dwindling and decide the only option they have remaining is the launch of a strategic nuclear weapon against Western Europe or the United States. And unfortunately, I don't think that progression of escalation is way off track. Very interested in what you think. I will, again, link the article in the description below if you want to check it out. But unfortunately, a pretty clear path to where nuclear war could start, which I guess we should wrap up with, so how do we avoid it if we're already on this path? I think the only solution, and I don't have necessarily the answer to this, but it would be peace. Find peace some way, somehow. Find a way to negotiate, find a way to compromise, whatever needs to be done, because this path that we're on risks spiraling to where decisions are made, again, that make sense at the time, hoping to stop the conflict, but only push it further and further and further. And if even one strategic nuclear weapon goes off anywhere in the world, it's going to be a problem for all of us.